Turn to the book of Esther, if you will. It's in the Old Testament. It's right before the book of Job. So you have, the first 5 books, the Torah, and then you have Joshua and Judges and Ruth. And then you have these books of history, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. Ezra, Nehemiah, and then Esther. Beautiful little book. It's only 10 chapters. It's a pretty quick read. I asked everybody last week we were together. Well, I think it was last week on my little devotion. I said, if you read the book of Esther, you would really be way ahead of today. And I'm not going to ask a show of hands who read it or who didn't. It's really okay. And if you haven't read it, you're going to get the movie version today. Now, how many people have ever went and saw a movie that you had read the book? All right, good majority of you. Did you enjoy the movie better or did you enjoy the book better?
The book.
Always. It just is so much better. So what you're going to get is the condensed movie. And I think it's pretty good, matter of fact, because the Holy Spirit has given me this wonderful story to tell you. So it's not anything I'm going to do. But I do love the overall story of Esther. But it's not like reading the book. So if you haven't read the book of Esther, it honestly isn't a long read. How long do you think it took you to read it?
Maybe only half an hour, really.
It's really not a very long read, yeah. And Brandy read it one night this week, and that's pretty awesome for my wife to actually do that.
I get the abridged version.
But no, she did great, and she had a ton of questions. Wanda and I went to breakfast yesterday morning, and Wanda had questions, so it's wonderful. And so, I don't have all the answers, of course, because I read it and I have questions. But, God is in that business of wanting to show us something through what we read. And you know what? God will show you something that's different than what I see. And God will show you something different today when you read it than you did maybe 10 years ago when you read it. Or even last year. As I read the Bible through every year, I always read passages over again, and there's something else that just leaps out at me. You all probably know, like, one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible is where Jesus came to Peter and asked him, "Do you love me?" And that passage, every time I read it, there's just always something that's more meaningful in my life, that helps me in my walk, that encourages me in what I'm doing. And when I'm discouraged, man, I like to turn to that last chapter in John and just read about Peter, because he was the ultimate in discouragement. It was like, you know what, after 3.5 years with this man, knowing that he was the Messiah and the Son of God, watched him die, and then knew that he raised from the dead even. He was discouraged. He's like, I can't do this thing. I'm going to go back to fishing, because that's what I know. And yet, Jesus turned his life around. Of course, we know the rest, what happened to Peter. So that's an awesome story, and that's a story we can have. Esther is one of those kind of stories for me. It's really funny, because about 3 weeks ago, as I told you guys that I wanted to take December off from our normal Bible reading in Romans and kind of do things that maybe are a little more oriented for what we need here at Hands and Feet Fellowship, and that's what I did 2 weeks ago. With that, we've lost our love. I don't want to see us lose our love, our passion, and our compassion for people, because that's really important. And then, so it was about that week, though, that I read the book of Esther, just as part of my Bible reading. And as I got towards the end of the book, it talked about this feast of Purim. And it's Purim or Purim. If you really want to be a rookie, if you read it, it's P-U-R-I-M, you say Purim. Jews will really, you've really mispronounced the word. It's like Winnie the Pooh. It's Purim, or Purim is a little bit closer to what they would say in Hebrew. But Purim, yeah. So they had this feast of Purim, and it's one of the feasts that the Jews celebrate every year, just like Passover. And we talked about Passover here just a few weeks ago. Purim is another one of those feasts. Now, it's called a minor feast, and the reason it's called a minor feast is because the Jews themselves instituted this among themselves. It wasn't something that God did. In fact, what's really fascinating about the book of Esther is that God's name is not mentioned one time in the entire book. Not once. Not once does it say anything about praying to God, worshiping God, God exists, God is our God. Nada. And yet the ruler, Xerxes, the king, seems to be the main character. He's mentioned 175 times in the book. God, 0. But it's a little like a modern day author called E.E. Cummings. Anybody ever heard of him? Anybody ever had to study him in high school? See, I'm 60 years old. We had to do that stuff. E.E. Cummings wrote a little poem, and the last word in the poem was left off. And the reason he left the word out was to emphasize the word so much more because you all knew what the word was. But it added so much more meaning to it because it wasn't there. Whoever authored Esther, it certainly wasn't Esther. Could have been Mordecai, could have been Ezra or Nehemiah. They all lived in this era. And Ezra and Nehemiah wrote books. We think that Nehemiah wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel that we've actually been studying. But nevertheless, whoever it was, I think purposely left the name of God out of the book because God is the main character in the book. You see everything that he's doing in the book of Esther. So that's just my opinion, and so whatever that's worth, but he's not mentioned. So if you turn to Esther and the first chapter, you start, the opening scene in the movie is this king. And if you have the NIV, if you have the New International Version, it talks about his name being Xerxes, King Xerxes. Now he has many other names, and y'all can go look them up if you want to. The Hebrew has a name for him, and then of course the Persians had a different name. Xerxes, this is not the Persian name. This was not his Persian name. I believe that is actually the word that's used in the King James Version, Ahasuerus. Now you see why I don't want to. I have trouble with that name, and I have trouble with the Hebrew name too, so I'm going to call him Xerxes. Xerxes is the Greek name. Now you might find that pretty odd because he's the one that fought against the Greeks. But guess what? The Greeks prevailed. And so there was some Greek historians that wrote about him, and so we know him better in history as Xerxes. If anyone ever watched the movie 300? All right. In that movie, the king in that movie, the Persians that are trying to defeat, we are Sparta, is Xerxes. And this is this literal Bible character. This is literally when this story takes place, is during that very time that he is attacking Greece and he's trying to take over Greece because Xerxes' empire, the Mede and Persian empire, spanned from Libya and Africa all the way to India, modern-day Pakistan. That's how the entire Middle East, except for this little country of Greece. And they somehow just couldn't see. There are stories that he might have had 1 million foot soldiers, the Persians did. But modern-day scholars seem to think it's more like a few 100,000. That the Greeks who wrote the history at this time, they wanted to say he had 1 million because they want to be so proud that they could defeat an army of 1 million with just their few soldiers they did. I mean, if you've watched the movie 300, you understand. The 300 literally turned back thousands because of the way that the battle went. So I won't give it away if y'all ever want to watch the movie. But so that's this deal. This little country hung on. All right, and so he's having this trouble. But this is the king, of course. And let me get myself a little organized here. All right. So Xerxes, he's the main character, and then his dad, just so that you know, is mentioned in Daniel, the book of Daniel. So y'all understand that the Bible's actually laid out in a great pattern. The first 5 books are the books of Moses that we believe Moses wrote, called the Pentateuch. Penta meaning 5, and so those are the books of the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then you start this historical record of what Israel did. So Joshua was the first historical record when they moved into the Promised Land. And then they didn't have a king. God was their king. It was the first theocratic government ever devised. This is one of the reasons why we don't teach tithing, being 10% here, because that was given to the theocratic government of Israel because that's how their government ran. And anyone that would tell you that God wants a tithe of 10% of your money, and that's what you should give to the church, is not even interpreting the law correctly. Because that 10% went just to the theocratic government, and 6 months later you were supposed to give another 10% that went to the Levites. So that would be 20%, would it not? And then every 3 years you were supposed to give a special tithe to the poor. Right? So that's about 23 1/3% every year. 3 1/3 would be kept every year for that 10% every third year, right? So if you really wanted to teach Old Testament tithing to a New Testament church, you should say that you should at least be given 23 1/3%. And the reason I do not teach that is because it was a theocratic government. It needed money to run. How much money do you pay your government to run so that you can drive on this road out here? You know?
Too much.
Too much, probably. That's exactly right. I would agree with you. But nevertheless, we pay a lot of our money to that. So you could argue the fact I already pay my 23 1/3% to the United States government, right? That's why Paul insisted in the New Testament, listen, you don't have to be like the law anymore. You don't have to get circumcised. You don't have to give a tithe. You don't have to sacrifice a bull anymore, okay? We don't do that anymore, all right? We live under the new covenant. Paul says that don't think that 10% is God's. 100% is God's. It's all God's.
Amen.
So now you give back to God whatever you feel like God's placed on your heart to give back. And that's what we do and that's what we teach, okay? Didn't mean to get too diverted, but I do want you to understand that's what these guys were. Darius and Cyrus the Great, these were both kings before. These are the predecessors of Xerxes, his father and his grandfather. And we read Cyrus in the book of Daniel was the first. He defeated Belteshazzar and that great Babylonian kingdom that fell because Daniel read those things where the writing was on the wall, many tekel. It's like, you have been weighed and found wanting. And Daniel says, your kingdom will fall this very night to the Persians. That was Cyrus. Listen, Cyrus had a great love for the Jewish people. He really did. And they were in captivity from Babylon. You've got to know that. And the Babylonians were not very good to the Israelites. And Cyrus wanted to change that. And he said, listen, I'm going to make it so that after my reign, 70 years, you stay here 70 more years, you've completed your being slaves here. You've completed your task. After 70 years, you can go back home. So under Darius, they went back to the promised land. And the reason that they did that was because of a guy named Nehemiah, who was Cyrus's cupbearer. He would taste everything so that somebody trying to poison the king and kill him, he wouldn't die, right? So that's your history. That's how they come back. So Xerxes, he's third generation. He has neither love nor hate towards the Jews. From what we can read and what we can gather, he didn't care really one way or the other about the Jews, all right? So what he did was he said, we all live in peace now. We're not under slavery anymore. They can go back home if they want. But you know what? Many of the Jews loved the Persian Empire, and they stayed right there, right here in this great city of Susa. There was really quite a contingency of Jewish people that stayed there. And we're going to introduce you to another one here pretty soon. The other characters in the first chapter are Vashti, which is the queen, Xerxes' queen. And then we get a little bit, we get this great story about how Xerxes wanted to plan how to defeat the Greeks, okay? So he spent 6 months, he called for the 6-month summit meeting. He had all his leaders come from all over the country, and they sat for 6 months, and they devised a plan to defeat the Greeks. And when they were done at the end of 6 months, they were very happy with their plans. They're like, man, them Greeks are going to fall just like that. We're going to take over the entire world. This is our last little thorn in the flesh, and we're going to get rid of them. In fact, Xerxes felt so good about their plans that he threw this huge banquet at the end, 7 days of nothing but feasting, and he instructed the wine stewards to just give them all the wine they wanted to drink. So you could just get, you know what I'm talking about. Exactly. There's words for that we can't use in church. And that's, loaded. That's a good one. And you can stay loaded for the entire week, okay? So they were so loaded at the end of the 7th week, I think there was too much wine in the king's head, and he decided, you know what? Let's bring out my wife. You know what? She is so beautiful. And if you read it in the book of Esther, he says, wearing her crown and her regalia. Now the Jews teach, the rabbis teach, that that's all he wanted her to wear. Her crown and the regalia that came with the crown, which would leave her not so clothed. And that's one of the reasons Vashti said, you know what, I think I'm going to pass on this one, okay? Bunch of drunken men for 7 days, and now you're going to call me in there. And by the way, she's been given a banquet for the women. So I noticed that the men and women were separate, and that was very common in those days, to do things separately. She's like, I don't think that's such a great idea for me to come running in there right now, so I'm not going to. Now look at verse 18. That's the key verse in chapter 1. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct, her saying no to the king, will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way, and there will be no end of disrespect and discord. Is this just not exactly how people are in the world today? when something doesn't go the way we think it should, we jump right to the conclusion of the very end, this huge overreacting to the whole situation. Oh my goodness, you know, the IRS has put a wage garnishment on Brandy and I's pay, okay, from something from back in 2002. And a lot of people would go, oh my goodness, it's Christmas. It's the end of the world. What are we going to do? Brandy just finally got a pretty decent job. We were just finally digging our way out of the hole, and I was just finally, you know, being able to give more to the church. And the IRS comes along and puts this big wage garnishment on it. But you know what? It's not the end of the world. And we're not going to overreact. And we're not going to say, oh, all the women in the kingdom was going to act like this. Really? I seriously doubt any of that. But that's, of course, what they thought. So they said, you need to depose Queen Vashti. So Xerxes thinks, you know what? He's embarrassed. All right? He's probably still a little hungover. And he's very embarrassed. She didn't do what I told her to do. And we're going to hear in just a few minutes how crazy he is anyway. So he's probably lucky she kept her life. Now there's another from the Greek historian that writes that Artaxerxes is Xerxes' son. He was born in the same year that this happened. So another presumption, probably pretty logical presumption, Vashti could have been pregnant at this point too. Remember, it was 6 months he's been in this big summit. They ain't been, you know, he's probably not had anything to do much with his wife. And so if he impregnated her before the summit started, it's very possible she's in her 3rd trimester. That's another reason she don't want to show up. It's like, I'm showing. And a lot of women are embarrassed at that point in their lives. They feel, you know, they don't feel as pretty. And I'm sure Vashti was a beautiful woman. I'm sure she was. But she's 9 months pregnant now. So it's like, I'm not going out there. It could hurt the baby or something. You know, I just don't need all that. So that's a possibility, okay? I'm not saying it is. The Bible doesn't say. And I think those are wonderful things because, honestly, it doesn't have a lot to do with the story. But that's exactly, you know, what we're looking at. All right. So now we come to chapter 2. Later, and I love this. You know how the Bible will give you a word like that, later? In the King James, it says, after these things. Well, how long is that? Is that like next Monday? Is that like next week? Try 2 years. Okay? So after this happened, for 2 years, the Persians have been without a queen. So why? Why wasn't Xerxes out there trying to get a queen? Well, this is the 2 years he spent trying to conquer those doggone Greeks. Okay? He had his engineers go out and build bridges near the Caspian Sea. Sean, you might understand this a little bit more, between Turkey and Greece. And there's that little, connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Caspian Sea, I believe. And so they built these bridges across there so that their armies could march across there. He had all these engineers build these fine bridges. Well, just before they got them done, or right as they got them done, but before they could use them, a big storm comes along and wipes out all these bridges. Xerxes is upset. He's like, y'all built me some inferior bridges. That's what they'd say to you too, wouldn't it, Sean? That's what your captain would say, right? You built me some inferior bridges. So guess what he did? He lined up all the engineers in the entire country and whacked their heads off. That's Xerxes, okay? That's why I say, Vashti probably got off pretty easy. Because he said, y'all don't know what you're doing. Why should you exist? Because if you can't be an engineer and build me a bridge. Then he was so upset at the ocean for doing what the ocean did to the bridges, he sent soldiers out into the ocean with whips to lash the water 300 times for its insubordination. While other soldiers took red-hot pokers and poked into the ocean, trying to, yeah, who knows?
Talk about anger, right?
You know that soldier's like, oh boy.
This is our King Xerxes, okay? So if you think he's not quite all there, this is our main character that we're talking about in the book of Esther, all right? But nevertheless, you know, these people were very superstitious. They were very, you know, they had a god for the ocean, and they sacrificed to this god. You know, I mean, this is the way they felt. So he was upset at I just see him guy out there laughing. That just got to be funny, but God's got to have a sense of humor. I'm just telling you, because he's just like, man, I don't even have to do anything to that guy. He's already gone. So that's where later, between 1 and 2, that's what we had. Okay, we had 2 years. So he's soundly defeated in several battles. One of them being the 300 battle. We are Spartan. And so he comes back licking his wounds 2 years later, and he goes, "Hey, wasn't I looking for a queen? You know, this would be a great distraction right now, because really I'm not feeling very good about myself, and I can't even conquer this little country of Greece. I think it's time I get me a woman, all right? So he decides, and his people, we come up to chapter 2, and they start talking about picking a queen, okay? So we come to verse 5, and we're introduced to this beautiful character, one of the heroes in the book, verse 5 of chapter 2. Now there was in the citadel of Susa, or the city of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai. He was the son of Jair, which was the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Now, what I want you to see here is his lineage. You know, most of you think, well, lineage is not important anyway. Yes, it is, especially in this case. And a lot of times when lineage was given, they picked the highlights, not every single father and son. They didn't have to do that. They just picked the highlights. So when we're talking about Mordecai, he was in the tribe of, which tribe? Benjamin. Wow. If y'all been coming on Sunday night to 1 Samuel, you know of this great guy from the tribe of Benjamin. His name was Saul. Anybody remember Saul's father? Kish. So Mordecai is in the line of Saul, which was the king. All right? That's really important. We're going to catch that. We're going to come back to that. Just want you to know he's one of the sons of Saul. Mordecai had a cousin on verse 7, and this is our heroine. We have a hero in the movie, and now here's our heroine. And her name was Hadassah. Hadassah. That's her Jewish name, Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother, so she was an orphan. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, Esther was her Persian name. Esther, Persian, and in Persia, they had a goddess of love called Ishtar. Ishtar was the goddess of love, and so Xerxes gives her this name because she's so lovely, Esther, in honor of Ishtar. Had a lovely figure and was beautiful, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Now she's not just beautiful, because out of the 400 virgins that they from all over the kingdom that they give to King Xerxes to pick as a wife, he remembers her. He remembers her by name. She basically blew his socks off, and he's like, this is one beautiful person. So you see, just because you're an absolute beauty queen does not mean that you can't be used of God and in God's service. But Esther had so much more than just beauty. She was a beautiful woman, but man, did she possess something so much more and so much greater than that, and her humility. And look at verse 10. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Now this shows us a couple of things. One, it shows Esther's humility to her cousin that raised her, her older cousin. She was an orphan. Mordecai raised. He said, do not tell. She didn't question. She just didn't tell. But this hints to us in the story that there was a lot of anti-Semitism going on in this land of Persia. There were a lot of people that didn't like the Jews, okay? Xerxes probably didn't care one way or the other, but there were a lot of other people that didn't. Mordecai goes, you know what? Just best to not even say who you are. Do y'all realize that when we testify in our lives, in our workers, our fellow workers, we don't have to walk around with a t-shirt on that goes, I'm a born-again Christian, okay? Stuff that would just, it's going to turn some people off just right off the bat. It's like, I don't even want to talk to that guy. They'll walk and go the other way. That's not our task in life. People don't need to know who we are. They'll find out who we are soon enough. You don't think Xerxes is going to find out who Esther is? Sure he is. All right? You don't think Haman, the villain in here, is going to find out who she is? Yes, certainly he will. Okay? But right now, no need in spreading all that around. Okay? So that's verse 10. Now look at verse 15 just to show you how submissive she was. It says, when the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested, and Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Now, how many women do we know with this kind of beauty that could wow a king like this among all of this huge empire would have this kind of attitude? You don't think she'd have a little bit of like, hey, I'm something, okay? I mean, every woman I've ever met with that kind of beauty sort of has a little bit of that air. A little condescension, a little bit, I'm a little better than you. And until we interview them like Miss South Carolina, and then you find out, how much they actually know. Look at this humility that Esther had, all right? She won the favor of everyone's heart, including the king. So now the king is he's really blown away by this woman. She's not only beautiful, but man, she knows how to play the political game too. I mean, she's got it down, right? Look at verse 20. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instruction as she has done when he was bringing her up. See? She just continues to follow someone else's orders. Someone else. And during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, these two guys, two of the king's officers, you read in verse 21, they made this plot to kill King Xerxes. And Mordecai overhears it. So Mordecai goes and reports it, and it gets back to the king, and Mordecai gets credit for it to the people that's in the king's court, and of course they go hang these two people. Now, before we get too far, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but NIV and King James Version translations, I want you to understand the difference between the two. It says in verse 23, and a report was, this NIV now, and when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. Look at the King James Version. And when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree. Now, I think of impaled on a pole, and I did get this first time I met it. It was like this big, sharp pole, and they were like impaled on this pole. That's what I really thought. But honestly, that's not what the NIV is even saying. The pole was like this tall, they didn't have metal poles. At wooden poles, and they impaled them on the pole. This is where crucifixion started. The world didn't even know what crucifixion was until the Persian Empire. The Persians were the first to execute people by crucifixion. They were hanged on a tree. Okay? So that's what this means. Don't want any confusion there. So now we get to chapter 3, and now we introduce the villain. We've seen the king, the main character. We've seen our hero and our heroine, Mordecai and Esther. Now we meet our villain. Verse 3, chapter 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of whoever that is, the Agagite. That's the important part. Elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. It really kind of infers that Haman's second in command to Xerxes. He's higher than all the other nobles, right? We don't know why he honored him like that. I don't know what he did to get this position. It's not written in the Word. And to be honest, I didn't study Greek history to figure out why. I don't even know if it was explained to me. The fact is, he was honored by the king. The main thing, though, is to know that he was an Agagite. Have we not been studying in 1 Samuel? Does that name not ring a bell? Agag? Who was Agag? He was the king of the Amalekites. And what did God say to do to the Amalekites? You wipe them out. Man, woman, child, kill their cows. I want them gone. Why? Look here. Here's another one of them Amalekites showing up 1,000 years later. In the direct descendant of King Agag. See, Saul didn't even get Agag's whole family. But what happened to Agag when Samuel showed up and found out that he had left the king alive? Samuel hacked him to pieces. This is a historical fact, people. So here's a guy named Haman. He is a son of Agag, who was hacked to pieces by a Jew. And that's all he remembers. And that's all he needs to remember. So every Jew he ever sees from then on, Jew hacked my great-great-grandfather to death. And I don't like them. They tried to destroy my entire family name. See how beautiful the Bible is when it just writes these little words. We just gloss over and go through the story. We don't even understand. See how much we understand the motive behind this anger between Haman and Mordecai. All right? So we'll look at verse 6. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. See, Mordecai wouldn't bow to him, and the king had ordered everyone to bow to Haman because he made him second in charge. And Mordecai, being a Jew, he doesn't bow to anybody. We serve one God, we don't bow. Y'all remember from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't bow. Daniel, he continued to pray. Mordecai, he's in that same realm. He's like, I'm not bowing to this guy. Who is he? All right? Well, Haman said it's not good enough to just kill Mordecai. He really just hates this guy because everybody will bow, and this one dude standing up, just like a little sore thumb. And it's like he cannot stand him. But his hatred isn't just for this man. What does it say? Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Now, they're probably somewhere towards 50 million Jews at this point, spread out through that whole kingdom. He's going to wipe them all out, every single one of them, because of Mordecai, and because some Jew hacked my dad to death. Motive enough, right? All right. Now look at verse 11. So he goes to the king. He tells the king, I'll put money in your coffers if you'll let me destroy all these Jews, because listen, there are bad people anyway. They won't bow to you. By the way, he gives it to the king. He doesn't even bring it personally. He says, listen, they don't care nothing about worshiping you. They've got their own little god that they worship, and they need to be wiped off the face of the earth, and I'll give you so much money if you'll let me do that. And what does Xerxes say in verse 11? Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. See, Xerxes don't care one way or the other, but he sort of convinced him that, well, maybe they are kind of a thorn in the side. I don't know. Get rid of them. Wow. Do as you want. So they sent notices to everybody in all the provinces that this is going to happen. Notice that Haman cast lots to see when this should happen. And it just so happened that it comes to the month of Adar. When is the month of Adar on the Jewish calendar? The 12th month. Are you already beginning to get a little hint why I decided to preach this message today? The 12th month. For 2 days, they're going to annihilate all the Jews in all of the provinces. So they cast a lot. The Persian word for lot is pur. Pur. That's how we get the feast of Purim, because they cast lots for their day of destruction. All right, so we know that. All right, moving on. Let's get to chapter. Well, let's read the last bit of chapter 3, the last verse, or verse 13. Dispatchers were sent with orders to destroy, kill, and annihilate. I love that. Destroy should have been enough, but we're going to destroy, we're going to kill, we're going to annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month of the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Yeah, you know, Jews had a lot of wealth too, and that was another thing that Xerxes probably appealed to Xerxes, that he'd get all this new wealth. Okay? So here's the story, and the note goes out. Now, you're a Jew, and you live in the Persian Empire. How you feeling right about now? Some edict came out to the second command of the Persian Empire. All of a sudden, you know, you're doing fine, we're all getting along, you know, we're all buddies. But God says, that's not what I want. You're supposed to be separate from the world. You're supposed to be my witness to the world. Why are you hanging around in here? See, God has a way of his people doing what God wants done. So God sends adversity. And one day, in their normal life, and their life has been turned upside down. So we come to chapter 4. And now Mordecai goes into sackcloth and ashes, and mourns and wails and weeps, because his people, in about 9 months, 10 months, 11 months, are going to be annihilated from off the face of the earth by this Haman. That was his edict anyway. And he's pretty upset. So look at verse 9. This is Haman's trying to get a message back to his cousin Esther, who is the queen. So chapter 5, verse 9, he says to her, hang on just a minute. I want to go back to chapter 4. I'm sorry, I'm still in chapter 4. I want you to look at verse 11 in chapter 4. My bad. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law: they that be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to the king. This is the message that she sends back to Mordecai. All right, so let me catch you up a little bit. Mordecai sends word in his sackcloth and ashes to Esther that there's a problem. And Esther sends him back clothes so that he can come into the royal court and she can see him face to face. But he doesn't take the clothes. He stays in sackcloth and ashes. So he sends word back to her and says, listen, we are about to be annihilated as a people. I don't know what you're doing in that palace. I don't think you're hearing what's going on. So he actually sends her a notice and says, we're all going to be killed in the month of Adar. On the 14th day of Adar, we're all going to be annihilated. You need to go to the king and you need to tell him who you are. Now you need to tell him who you are. She's probably thinking, man, you've been telling me all this time. Don't be saying who I am. This is the time right now to really not let him know. And so she sends him a very reasonable statement, what we just read. You can't just go before the king. You show up in the outer court, and if the king summons you, you can go to the inner court, and then you can have your meeting with the king. But if he doesn't summon you, you can't just show up in the inner court and have your meeting with the king. We're going to read a little later where Haman came to the outer court. He probably came every day waiting for the king to call him. And the king called him almost every day because he's the second in command, right? But when he called him, then Haman came in, right? That's what Esther would do. She would go every day in case the king wanted her. She would go every day to the outer court. And so what she's telling Mordecai is, listen, for 30 days I've been in the outer court. He never calls me in. I can't just walk in. What does Mordecai tell her? So when Esther's words were reported, verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your family's house will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Man, those are just some of the greatest words that Mordecai ever said in his life. First off, look at the faith Mordecai said. Mordecai goes, you know what? Go ahead. Keep your mouth shut. Do you not think that you will not die? You and your family will certainly die. They will find out you're a Jew. Don't even think twice about it. And I'm going to tell you something else too. God will find another way to rescue his people. Look at the faith this man had. He knew that the Jewish people wouldn't be wiped out. God promised Abraham that he is going to send a Messiah to this world, right? He promised Isaac. He promised Jacob. He sent it through Judah. This is what he promised. So Mordecai has no doubt it's going to happen. You're not going to wipe all the Jews out. You can't. So if you don't rescue us, guess what? God will find another way. But he doesn't say God here, does it? He just goes, there will be another way for us to exist. That shows even greater faith. He doesn't even mention the name of God. He just knows it as a fact. He knows it as a scientific fact. We're not going anywhere. We're on this earth for a reason. We're not going anywhere. And then he says these beautiful words to Esther that I want us to think about this morning. How do you not know that the reason that you've been given this wonderful position as queen, how do you not know that you were orphaned and put into my household so that I could bring you before the king? How do you not know that your beauty has surpassed all other women's beauty for such a time as this? God needs you now. I'll suggest to you this morning, here, at Hands and Feet Fellowship, how do you not know that God has you here, right now, today, for a very special purpose? For this very special time in your life. For you to make a decision to do what it is that God is asking you to do. That you stop running away from what it is that God wants you to do. Esther, you can't run. You can't hide. How do you know that this isn't the time that you've been called to do what it is that you need to do? And then these beautiful words. Verse 15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Now, what did they do when they fasted? They didn't eat, of course, but they prayed. And who'd they pray to? Their God. Why wasn't this said? Because that's just what you did when you fasted. Esther doesn't have to say all those things. It's known. But that's the beauty of the author of this story. Once again, God's still not mentioned, but yet God is the main character. Fast, pray for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Can you say that this morning? If God was calling you to be a missionary to an island off of India where no one goes, where no outsider is allowed, and yet this missionary, last month you might have read about him in the paper, he's a Mormon, but his zeal for God is unsurpassed. He's a Mormon with this kind of zeal. It shows me something. He says they need Christianity on that island. Do we not believe that no other name under heaven, there is no other name under heaven by which man can be saved other than the name of Jesus Christ? Do we believe that? Then he believed that he needed to go to that island and witness to those people because they don't let outsiders in, and they are eternally damned. They are not going to heaven. They don't even have a chance. And I want to go. And they killed him. And in a letter that he had sent to the fishermen before he died, he said, I don't want to die. But that wasn't the key point. What he said afterwards was the key point. I don't want to die because if I die, who else will go? Who will go in my place? He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of not accomplishing the mission. So he would row in his little boat and he would quote from Genesis to these people the words of the Bible. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they jeered. Finally they had enough of him and they killed him with their bows and arrows. Esther said, if I perish, I perish. But I'm going to do the will of God. Let's bow our heads.